You have been doing this for years. You look at a pattern in your life, a relationship that ended the exact same way the previous one did, a job you abandoned at the exact same turning point as always, a reaction you swore you wouldn't have again, and you arrive at the same conclusion. That something inside you is wrong. It's a quiet flaw, not dramatic enough for the outside world to easily see, but too specific to be a coincidence, too personal to be bad luck, too uniquely yours to be anyone else's fault. And so, you go on living with this conclusion installed in some place you never show to anyone. There is a detail about Carl Jung that most people don't know. Before becoming the most influential psychologist of the 20th century, before the shadow, the collective unconscious, the archetypes, Jung worked for years at a psychiatric hospital in Zurich called Burghölzli. He spent hours with patients the world had already discarded, people whom other doctors observed from afar, with clinical detachment, using diagnoses that functioned as life sentences. Jung sat close. He listened. And what he heard, repeated in infinite variations, in stories that seemed to have nothing in common, was a recurring tragedy. People who had never learned to name what they felt. They were never given permission to be anything different from what they were taught to be. They grew up convinced that the problem was them, when the real problem was what had been done to them. Jung refused to call this moral weakness. He identified it as the dissociation of the self, the exact point where a person separates from fundamental parts of themselves because their surroundings never offered any other option. Now, meet Daniel, 37 years old, a financial consultant in Chicago. The kind of man people describe as reliable, which, if you pay close attention, is an observation about availability rather than a compliment. It's Tuesday night. Daniel is sitting in his car in his building's parking garage. The engine is off. He cannot remember parking. What he can remember is the 3 o'clock meeting, where he agreed to a proposal he knew was wrong, and dinner with Laura, where she said, "You are never really here." He didn't disagree because it wasn't a lie, and he didn't agree because agreeing would mean having to do something about it. Daniel is not in a visible crisis. That is precisely what makes him so hard to see. He is exactly where he has always been. Functional enough not to ask for help, uncomfortable enough to know that something isn't right, and completely lacking the words to name the distance between those two states. He thinks the problem is him. Jung would say the problem is what Daniel was never taught to see. This channel exists for people who have stopped accepting superficial explanations about themselves. If this resonates with you, subscribe now, because what comes next goes deeper than you expect. And the next video will go deeper still. Chapter 1. What was installed? There is a version of you that was built before you even knew it was being built. This structure wasn't created maliciously, or necessarily by bad people. It was passed down by adults who were also built, by environments that were also inherited. These patterns repeat simply because no one ever stopped to question if they were true. Here is how it works. When you were a child, you had a full spectrum of emotional responses available to you. Anger, sadness, joy, fear, need, vulnerability. All of these experiences existed within you as real possibilities, as languages your nervous system was ready to speak. And then, the world around you began to respond. When you cried and no one came, or worse, when someone came angry, you learned that need is inconvenient. When you expressed anger and the atmosphere of the house became heavy, or when the person you loved withdrew, you learned that anger is dangerous. When you got excited about something and the adult in the room reacted with irony or indifference, you learned that enthusiasm exposes you to pain. This lesson wasn't taught in words. It was taught in silences, in facial expressions, in shifts of emotional temperature that you detected even before you had the language to describe them. Jung called this process the construction of the persona, the mask the individual creates to navigate their social world. And he was precise about one thing. The persona is real. It was necessary. It worked. It saved something inside you when you had no other options. Creating it wasn't the mistake. The tragedy is that you grew up believing the mask was your actual face. Daniel is the oldest of 3 siblings, an absent father, not by abandonment, but by an anxious, hovering presence. A man who was always home and never available. A mother who loved with an intensity and expectation that were rarely separate. In Daniel's house, emotions existed, but they lived in an unstated hierarchy. The mother's anxiety was paramount and needed a response. The father's silence was heavy and needed to be managed. Daniel's emotions were real, but there was no structural space left for them. So Daniel, with the adaptive intelligence of a child who wants to survive the love of the people who depend on him, learned to push them down. He didn't eliminate them. He relocated them. He learned to function with them pressed against the bottom, like someone who learns to walk with a weight they have carried long enough to forget it's there. And as an adult, Daniel looks at himself and sees a man who can't really connect, who knows he should feel more but can't, who functions well but is never present. And he concludes, "Something inside me is wrong." Jung would have offered a different perspective. Everything that is unconscious is projected. Daniel isn't making things up. Rather, what was never allowed to exist in consciousness doesn't disappear. It simply finds darker ways to express itself. Frequently, these symptoms appear to be the core issue, when they are actually the footprints of an older problem. Essential parts of Daniel's self were banished to the dark for his own relational survival. He isn't broken. He is just trying to navigate with half the map. Here is what is impossible to deny. You did not choose the environment in which your nervous system was calibrated. You did not choose which emotions were granted. Here is what is impossible to deny. You did not choose the environment in which your nervous system was calibrated. You did not choose which emotions were granted permission to exist and which were taught to be silent. All of this happened before you had the capacity for critical evaluation. And now, you carry the heavy result of that adaptation as if it were your true character. Chapter 2. The shadow you call a flaw. Jung had a concept that people quote frequently and understand rarely: the shadow. Far from being just a bad side or a secret vault of shame, the shadow is something more precise. It is the repository for everything that has been banished from your conscious self. Everything your early world declared unacceptable, weak, inconvenient, or irrelevant was pushed out of your awareness. And here is the psychological mechanism no one ever taught you. What goes into the shadow gathers weight. It becomes denser, more charged, and it inevitably finds ways to return, usually disguised as a flaw. The anger Daniel never learned to express directly, it returns as passive-aggressive sarcasm he cannot control, as disproportionate road rage, as the emotional detachment Laura calls coldness, because he lacks the internal language for what is actually happening. The need he learned was inconvenient. It returns as hypercompetence, as the compulsion to be useful before anyone even asks, as a feeling of acute discomfort when someone offers to help him, because receiving care activates a vulnerability he was forced to bury. The silence forced upon his younger self returns as the distance he keeps from his own life. His inability to be present isn't because he doesn't want to connect. It's because being present would mean drowning in feelings he doesn't have the tools to process. Daniel is standing in the kitchen at 11 p.m. after Laura has gone to sleep. He is washing a glass that was already clean. He is thinking about the 3 o'clock meeting, trying to understand why he agreed. He attempts to grasp what he felt in that moment and encounters total blankness. It's not that he didn't feel anything. It's just that his internal vocabulary has no name for it. It went into the shadow so early that the words were never formed. This is what Jung called alienation from the self. It is the predictable result of a childhood that failed to provide the tools to integrate the full human experience. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. Jung was describing a universal human mechanism when he wrote that. It's what you do every time you fill a quiet room with your phone. Every time you convert anxiety into frantic productivity. Every time you numb yourself and call it being okay. This happens simply because no one taught you that feeling is a skill, and skills that are left untaught do not develop on their own. They remain frozen in infancy while you grow old around them. Here is what is impossible to deny. What you call a flaw in yourself, the coldness, the distance, the repeating pattern, has a specific origin. It is not your fundamental nature. It is the output of a nervous system calibrated by people who were themselves calibrated by a long chain of unexamined history. You are operating with instructions that were written before you even existed. Chapter 3. Jung as a witness. In 1912, Jung broke with Freud. The rupture was deeply personal, driven by a profound intellectual divide. Freud viewed the unconscious primarily as a dark cellar for the repressed, forbidden desires, traumas, and ugly impulses. Jung went further. He proposed that the unconscious was also a soil where beautiful, vital possibilities lived. Possibilities that had simply never been granted permission to grow. This distinction changes everything. Freud focused on what was suppressed. Jung focused on what was underdeveloped. Suppression implies that something existed and was pushed down. Underdevelopment means something was never given the conditions to emerge in the first place. Daniel did not suppress his capacity to connect. He was simply never taught how. Jung spent decades documenting what happens to a life when parts of the self are starved of the conditions to develop. He called the remedy individuation, the deliberate, conscious labor of becoming whole. It is the process of stripping away what the environment decided you should be, to reveal who existed before those decisions were made. The greatest and most important problems of life are all fundamentally insoluble. They can never be solved, but only outgrown. This isn't pessimism, it's a technical distinction. You are not going to solve a personality built over decades of unconscious calibration. Instead, you develop the capacity to live with more of yourself visible, first to you, and then to everyone else. Jung insisted that this path is much more about revelation than it is about repair. In fact, psychologists who worked closely with Jung noticed a strange pattern in patients. The hardest moment wasn't confronting their trauma. It was confronting the possibility that they weren't actually the problem. Admitting that you are the product of a system that starved you of the proper tools means you have to rebuild your entire identity. And that openness can feel far more terrifying than staying inside a familiar, painful narrative. It is strangely comforting to believe you are fundamentally broken. Being the problem has the perverse clarity of a final sentence. Accepting that you simply lacked the tools requires you to look at what is still possible. And looking at potential, after years of believing your limitations are permanent, is dizzying. Jung knew this deeply. To know your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darknesses of other people. True integration happens when you look into the shadow and realize it wasn't inherently evil or dark. It was just a part of you that had never received any light. Here is what is impossible to deny. Jung did not invent an abstract theory. He described with clinical precision what happens when a human being spends decades locked away from themselves, and the profound shift that occurs when those doors begin to open. He saw it in hundreds of people who, just like you, were utterly convinced that the problem was them. Chapter 4. What to do with what you now know. Jung was never naive about this process. He never claimed that merely naming the mechanism would dissolve it. The reality is much harder. The work is slow, deeply uncomfortable, and avoided by most. Not due to a lack of intelligence, but because the very habits that created the problem rarely offer the tools to solve it. You were wired for a specific set of survival responses. Those responses worked perfectly in the childhood home that required them. The trouble is, you left that world decades ago, but the programming stayed behind. Unexamined defenses do not evolve. They simply repeat with growing discomfort, leaving you with a vague feeling that you are failing at life without knowing why. The first step isn't transformation, it is recognition. You must give language to what has existed without words. What has no name cannot be examined, and what cannot be examined cannot be consciously chosen or refused. Daniel, that night in the kitchen, didn't need a massive life resolution. He just needed a word for the constriction in his chest when he gave in during that 3 o'clock meeting. A word for the panic that rises when Laura asks for real presence. He needed a map, not a judgment. Without that map, you aren't just lost. You mistake the confusion for your actual identity. Individuation begins with a radical honesty about what is, including the parts you were taught to hate. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. This is a functional description of the autopilot running your life. What remains unnamed remains unchosen. What is unchosen repeats, and what repeats eventually feels like destiny. The difference between who you are and what you learn to do to survive is everything. You cannot change what you cannot see, and you cannot see what you have never named. The healing journey doesn't start with willpower or intense commitment. It begins with the willingness to look at yourself without immediately assuming something is wrong with you. Maybe nothing is. Maybe it is just a structure that was built, which means slowly it can be rebuilt a different way. Chapter 5. Integration. 3 weeks after that night in the garage, Daniel did one small thing. In a meeting, a colleague proposed something he knew was wrong. Instead of his automatic 40-year-old habit of nodding along, Daniel stayed silent for a second longer than was comfortable. And then he said, "I need a moment to think about this before I respond." It wasn't a dramatic showdown. No one else in the room noticed anything shift. But Daniel noticed. Because that single second of a pause between the stimulus and his automatic compliance was the very first piece of space he had ever created between his programming and his choice. Jung called this the birth of consciousness. It's not a sudden enlightenment. It is a single second of a pause where there used to be only blind reaction. That is how the map expands. Not by forcing yourself to be different, but by realizing there is a thin line between what was installed in you and who you actually are. That tiny difference belongs entirely to you. Remember the beginning of this video? You look at a pattern in your life, and you always arrive at the same conclusion: that something inside you is wrong. Now you can see that this conclusion is itself part of the old loop. The reflex to see yourself as the root cause of the failure was a survival skill taught to you by people who had no other language available. It is a chain of blindness that perpetuated itself not out of malice, but out of the total absence of an alternative. You weren't seeing the truth about yourself when you blamed your nature. You were just repeating what you were trained to conclude. You now know that what you used to call a personal flaw has a history, and histories are not life sentences. You now know that the programming installed before you could even think is not your identity. The work ahead isn't about fixing a broken object. It is a slow, specific revelation of what was always there, underneath who you were told to be. Daniel's journey will be circular. He will still agree when he should say no. He will still pull away when Laura asks for closeness. He will still reach for the incomplete map in moments of stress. But now he knows it is just a map, and maps can be redrawn. Yours can be too. If you recognized something in yourself while watching this, then you already know that this kind of honesty is worth more than any quick advice. Subscribe. Not to learn more, but to continue this process. If you want to pick up right where this video left off, one of the videos appearing on your screen right now was made directly for what you are feeling.